In the 1920s, the world was a different place. And as we know, people always try to get the best care they can for their kids. And what they understand it to be changes a lot depending on when and where that is. And in the 1920s, the wealthiest people would take themselves to expensive hospitals where they would be cared for around the clock by the nursing staff, just like they do now. Now, the difference was in the 1920s, there was a disease called hospitalism. Hospitalism would occur only to children who were in the hospital, and it would take about 2 weeks to set in. And once it set in, what would commonly happen is the children would become listless and they'd start to lose weight. They'd have digestive issues. And frankly, about 90% of the time, the children died. Now, a curious part about this is that the people whose children would die of hospitalism were mostly wealthy people who could afford the best care, and they tried to give them the best care. And here's the thing that's really curious about that. Usually it's the opposite. It's usually the poor people who die. And it's the poor people who are trying to emulate the rich for obvious reasons because of comfort and power and prestige and status and all these things. And you know, for generations, this is what people have done. They've tried to follow what the rich do. Well, around the same time, at the turn of the century, there was some scientists who discovered that if you take a chicken egg and you put it in an incubator where it's kept warm, you are suddenly realizing that the chickens are more likely to hatch and be healthy and strong, and we will all have more, chicken nuggets to eat. And then someone had the idea, like, well, human animals, we do well in the warmth too. So why don't we take children, small infants and premature babies, and put them in incubators, and they will probably heal even better. Well, lo and behold, the children in incubators were even more likely to die by hospitalism. So, what do we have here? We have this disease that we don't even talk about anymore that is killing children, and mostly and only the ones of the rich. Poor children don't have this issue. So let's unpack this for a moment. First off, poor children couldn't go to hospitals. And the nature of care at the time was very different than it is now. In the 1920s, the idea was that children need food and they need warmth. They don't need adult interaction. They don't need comfort. And so what would happen is, as the 1950s and 60s progressed, and children were allowed to have visits by their parents, they were allowed to be comforted, hospitalism just suddenly receded. It just disappeared because of care and love. Now, what's really interesting about this is if you were a man in the 1920s, right, because we're just letting women out right now because they weren't generally focused on careers for all the social reasons. If you were a man in the 1920s, you're trying to get ahead. You're trying to get a better job. You're trying to emulate your wealthy boss, right? And if your wealthy boss is saying, blah, 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 this is how you take care of children, and well, apparently they figured something out because they have money and they have power and they have prestige. Perhaps we should do the same thing, right? And then, of course, in the 1920s, if you're trying to get ahead, you're probably working much more than 40 hours and you wouldn't be home that much anyway. And so if the advice is that, your kids don't really need care and comfort, it wouldn't be much of a stretch to go ahead and not give it to them. Now, on a side note, I'm really curious how much this aligns with issues of war from World War One. Men with PTSD who didn't have the ability to be emotionally available anyway, a whole different question. And we've also talked in the past about the nature of industrialization and how companies would build products that were eminently replaceable, and then they would create employees who were also replaceable. That's a side story. 1920s, men were being told they should not be comforting to their children. Also, the stories of this women's work. So, no wonder men are generally taught not to be emotionally available and connected. It's not a stretch. It's really not. So, at the 1920s into the 1950s, the classical era of being an American, right? And then they had boomer kids, right? The baby boomers, 1970s. A generation right after the civil rights movement generally failed, right? The 1970s, a movement of self-help, of self-growth, figuring out how to make yourself a stronger person. And you may have heard me talk in the past about issues of narcissism and preoccupation with self, right? And we hear about latchkey kids, all this confused generation where our parents were born in the 60s and 70s. So, that being said, when you notice it's difficult to be connected to your emotional life, don't be surprised, right? And when we think about our father's father's father, there's a thing where they did the best they could, and it wasn't very good. They didn't know better, right? It wasn't their fault that they were in that world, one where they were told that children shouldn't be comforted. It wasn't their fault that their parents didn't comfort them and they didn't learn the lessons. And they were responsible for doing better. Just as it's not our fault, my generation and your generation's fault, that we didn't get better emotional education and more nurturance. However, we are responsible for making the changes for ourselves and as society.